In this session, we are going to discuss another very important and very interesting perspective on state, that is known as the ecological perspective, popularly known as the green understanding or green perspective on state. Now, to have an understanding of this green understanding or green perspective of state, at the very beginning, perhaps we have to face a sort of awkward question. The question is that, normally speaking, those who believe in ecological view of life, all of you know that ecological view of life means, ecological orientation means environmental awareness. And those who are, say, concerned with the importance of environment, those who are concerned with preservation of nature, well, for them it is normal to view the state as something opposed to the idea of nature. State and nature, they are in a juxtapositionary situation. That is, they stand in a relation of opposition. That has been the normal viewpoint of ecology. Now, if that be so, that is, if the state is considered as something which is opposed to nature for the very reason that it is believed that the modern state actually is a threat to our environment. Modern state, it makes a sort of instrumentalist use of nature. It appropriates the resources of nature in order to serve, say, its own narrow, selfish interests. Now, if that be so, that is, if state and nature, state and our natural environment, they stand in a relation of juxtaposition, then how do we talk about, or is it possible for us at all to think of an ecological understanding of state? Because if it is opposed to the state, then what is the relevance, what is the significance of talking about an ecological perspective? To understand this question, we have to view this particular notion, that is the ecological perspective or ecological notion or ecological viewpoint in regard to the state, primarily, say, from two angles. First, we have to understand the traditional, the dominant view, which looks upon the state in a negative light, which views the state as something opposed to the idea of, as something contrary to the idea of our environment. There is, however, another viewpoint which has emerged in recent times, which does not take such an oppositional view of state, such a negative view of state. So, these two particular issues we have to keep in mind. One, the state viewed negatively by the ecologists, the other, the state viewed rather positively by the advocates of ecology. Now, to have an understanding that why the state is viewed negatively, and which in fact is the most dominant school under ecologism, to have an understanding of how this kind of argument developed, how this kind of understanding, this kind of orientation has developed, why it is that the ecologists are so strongly opposed to the idea of state, we have to take a quick look at the development of the modern state in the modern age. That is, the relationship between modernity and the modern state. To have an understanding of this issue, we have to appreciate the point that when the modern state arose in Europe, this modern state, right from the very beginning, its attitude towards nature was what one may describe as instrumentalist. That is, the modern state, in order to consolidate itself, in order to justify its existence, in order to deliver goods to society, that is, the modern state, in order to express itself, as a kind of institution of power, as a structure of power. The modern state, one can very well guess, one can very well sense, it required resources. And these resources had to be picked up. These resources had to be gathered from nature. So, the modern state made a merciless appropriation of nature in order to serve its own interests. That is the very typical ecological argument. And therefore, the modern state does not care for environment. The modern state does not care for natural resources. The modern state is a sort of anathema to nature, because the modern state's survival depends on the destruction of nature. This is the very typical ecological understanding. And this understanding, therefore, went into the making of the traditional dominant ecological perspective that the state is something which stands opposed to nature, and therefore the state is to be discarded, and we have to go back to nature. Now, going back to nature, it is justified specifically on this ground, that is, the state is modernist, and therefore modernity is a threat to nature. And therefore, if we have to not only save nature, if we have to survive on our own, that is, if the mankind has to survive, if civilization has to survive, then it is our precious duty to protect nature. Unless nature survives, well, we also do not survive. So state actually stands as a kind of threat to mankind as well as nature. On the basis of this understanding, what they try to do is, number one, they try to put forward the argument that the state is a nuisance, so the state has to be opposed. And number two, since the state stands as a kind of barrier between man and nature, state actually creates a problem in the negotiation between man and nature. Therefore, unless the state is dislodged, the proper relationship between man and nature cannot be established as it was at the dawn of civilization. So the typical ecological, the traditional, the dominant ecological argument is this, that we have to dislodge the state, we have to go back to nature from our present understanding of state, and the proper relationship, the original relationship between man and nature, the fusion between nature and man, that has got to be effected. So this is, broadly speaking, the crux of the ecological view of state. Now, if we look at the justification of this argument, if we look at how the ecologists have tried to justify, have tried to rationalize this argument, then one has to look at some of its variations. That is, from different angles, in different ways, the ecologists have put forward this particular kind of argument in order to justify what they try to talk about. The first important argument is that small is beautiful. It is associated with one scholar whose name is Fritz Schumacher. So Fritz Schumacher, so he actually picked up this phrase, the small is beautiful. Now small is beautiful, it means two things. First, there is the monstrous centrality of the state, which is present in our daily life. It is a phenomenon which we experience in our everyday existence. And it is a threat to mankind, it is a threat to nature, it is a threat to our life. So the state has to be curbed. And what has got to be appreciated is localism. That is, small local phenomenon. Small local phenomenon as they are generated by nature. That is, forests, trees, ponds, lakes, water bodies, things which have grown locally, things which have been generated by nature locally. So it is this localism which we have to appreciate, which we have to highlight vis-a-vis the centrality of the state. So this is argument number 1. Argument number 2. The ecologists, they are sharply opposed to the modern state's corporatization of resources. It is argued by the ecologists that the modern states, which is broadly speaking, excepting a few situations, excepting a few states, all over the world, broadly speaking, the modern state has become synonymous with a sort of neoliberal state. Now, that is the modern state, the modern capitalist state, it has become a representative of the corporate sector. So, the modern state is actually oriented towards corporatization of natural resources. These resources are put to commercial use, these resources are put to corporate use. Now, this corporatization of resources, it is leading to destruction of environment for the sake of profit. And this is telling upon not only nature, it is telling upon our history, it is telling upon our society, it is telling upon our values. So this narrow, selfish appropriation of natural resources in the interest of the corporate lobby, well, that is a major threat to mankind, that is a major threat to civilization. The third very important argument put forward by the advocates of green politics or green perspective is this. They believe that so far as the modern state is concerned, this state, because of its centrality, well, it is opposed to democracy. It is opposed to democracy in the sense that true democracy means participation. And the ecologists believe that the spirit of participatory democracy, well, that is evident only in man's creative, conscious negotiation with nature. So, man's participation in the life of nature, that actually promotes the idea of participatory democracy. So, it's a new, somewhat novel way of looking at democracy, viewing democracy. So, these are some of the standard arguments put forward by the ecologists so far as their opposition to state is concerned. But it is also a fact that among the ecologists themselves, and of course among scholars who do not share the ecological perspective, well, they raise certain objections also against this ecological understanding of state. Now, what are these objections? Basically, there are two such major objections raised by the opponents of this ecological perspective. The first opposition is, they argue that the ecologists, their whole perspective, their whole understanding is somewhat utopian. Utopian in the sense that their understanding is not connected with reality. It is an unreal, imaginary, romanticized understanding. Why romanticized? Why utopian? Why imaginary? Because this is an understanding which wants to make an absolute of nature in the sense that it believes that whatever is natural, well, that is beautiful, that is sacred. Through their formulation that we have to go back to nature, well, those who are critics of ecologism, they point out, well, this is a sort of absurd utopian dream in the modern life of our society. That is, we have problems with the modern state, all right. We have difficulties with the modern state, that is all right. But as against the state, or simply by opposing the state, simply by dismantling the state, if we just go back to nature, well, that will not solve anyway the problems of modern life. the modern life is so complex that we have to acknowledge it, we have to understand it. That is, the problems of modernity, well, which involves technology, which involves science, which involves values, which involves many other things. This complex multidimensionality of our life, well, it has to be addressed not simply by not dismantling the state or simply by going back to nature. So this is a sort of utopian, romanticized understanding of nature. This is one of their main objections. The second objection which the ecologists raise, that objection is also very, very important. They argue that when we talk about environmental pollution today, which is of course reality, and it is also a fact that this environmental pollution, the environmental problems which affect our daily life, well, these are problems which have emerged out of the modern state. It is also a fact that the modern state, its policy towards nature, the way it appropriates nature, the way it does not care for nature, well, this has created this problem of environmental pollution, global warming, and all these things. But the problem is that these issues, these difficulties, like global warming, greenhouse effect, etc., etc., well, these things you cannot settle, you cannot solve simply by going back from state to nature. That is, you cannot simply solve these problems by making an absolute of nature. These problems have to be settled by the states themselves. These are problems which have been created by the modern state, which are associated with the modern state. To settle these problems, what you have to do is that you have to take the state into confidence. Simply by discarding the state and simply by romanticizing nature, simply by envisioning a sort of utopian dream about nature, you cannot resolve these problems. So this is their second objection. So eventually, as I mentioned earlier, what we come across therefore is a new school of ecologism, a new understanding of ecological view of state. Earlier we have seen, and that of course is the traditional view, that is the dominant view, and even today, this is a kind of view which is shared by most of the representatives of the ecological school or ecological perspective. That is a typical anti-statism. That is, discard the state, dismantle the state, go back to nature, romanticize nature. So, state versus nature, and that is the typical standard ecological understanding. That is a negative view of state. But in recent times, a new understanding, as I have just mentioned, has also developed. That may be considered as the green perspective or the green alternative so far as the state is concerned. That is a positive alternative view of state. One philosopher, scholar, thinker, who has written extensively on ecology are Eckersley. So Eckersley, well, she has pointed out that we have to understand one thing. Simply by discarding the state, simply by opposing the state, simply by attacking the state, simply by considering the state as something negative in our life, well, it is not a very practical proposition. In our daily life, we have to acknowledge, we have to appreciate, we have to understand the existence of the state. We cannot just ignore the presence of the state in our daily life, whether we like it or not. And it is also a fact, she admits, that the modern state, to a large extent, is responsible for environmental degradation, for ecological crisis, for all sorts of environmental problems, environmental pollution, etc., etc. But still, what she points out is this: we cannot ignore the state. That is, you have to solve the problems by taking the state into account, by taking the state into confidence. Now, if this be so, she points out, we have to take a more positive view of the state. That does not mean that there is nothing wrong about the state. The state, of course, its policy towards environment, that has to be questioned. But what we have to take into account, what we have to consider is that the modern state is important. Its importance cannot be ignored. It's by taking the state into confidence, we have to develop a proper ecological perspective. Now, what exactly is meant by this green alternative? The green alternative primarily focuses on two things. One is sovereignty, the other is democracy. The green alternative, it is argued, it actually has enabled us to take a new, somewhat unconventional, somewhat non-traditional view of state sovereignty. That is, if we take the green view in consideration, then it will be possible for us, and it is necessary also, to have a fresh look at our traditional concept of sovereignty. In our earlier classes, we have seen that the notion of sovereignty, it is a major attribute of the modern state. The modern state, when it emerged, and the way it has advanced, the way it has consolidated itself and thereby expanded, well, sovereignty, its territorial aspect, that is, within its domain, the state is sovereign. So, this understanding is a major feature of the modern state. Those who are advocates of a positive green alternative, they argue or they suggest that in today's world, the kind of ecological problems that we are coming across, some of the problems I have already identified, global warming, greenhouse effect, etc., etc. Now, in order to tackle those problems, in order to negotiate these problems, the states have to negotiate among themselves. That is, all states will have to accept, will have to go by, will have to abide by certain norms in regard to preservation of global environment. That means you cannot say that I am sovereign, therefore I am free to pursue my own environmental policy by disregarding the universal norms which have been prescribed for the preservation of humanity, history and civilization. So all states therefore have to accept the fact that I am not just sovereign in the adoption of my environmental policy. So a new notion of sovereignty has emerged. Second point is regarding democracy. This point I have briefly hinted at earlier. That is, ecological understanding of state that promotes a new view of participatory democracy. In fact, in today's world, from an ecological perspective, what we have to consider is this: if because of a state's policy, wrong environmental policy, for instance, if the local people are affected, then these local people will have every right to express their grievance, express their voice, to register their protest in regard to the state. That is their voice, their problems, their demands, if they are affected by a local environmental problem, then these have to be heard by the state. And as a consequence, a new understanding, an expansionist understanding of democracy, it has emerged. That is, you have to hear the voice of the affected by the environmental policy. That is, people have to be viewed not simply as formal members of the state, not simply we are citizens. We have also another identity. One identity is our very formal statist identity. We are all citizens. But we also have a local identity of the affected. That is the kind of identity that we assume because of a wrong environmental policy, because of, say, wrong strategy adopted by the state in regard to environment, and for which we suffer. Now, if we suffer because of the wrong environmental policy of the state, then we have every right to register our protest in regard to the state. Therefore, by way of conclusion, we can point out, we can argue that ecological awareness, it has given rise to a totally new understanding of state, to a kind of perspective with which we were not familiar. That is, it is our sense of environmental awareness which has given rise to this notion of ecological perspective, which we have to appreciate, which we have to consider for the sake of our own survival, for the sake of survival of civilization history. Thank you.